for a beekeeper meeting. It's really great, and I haven't been here with this group yet, so I'm excited to talk with you about a subject that I think gets much less attention than it deserves. That's propolis. But how I kind of got into propolis is really the thing that excites me most about honeybees is kind of this interplay of how there's tens of thousands of individual bees all running around, and it, to many it looks like chaos, but it's really coordinated chaos in a lot of ways. And you have these individuals all functioning as a colony, and that colony can be a superorganism or an individual itself. So as we all know, if the colony doesn't make it, then those individuals don't make it either. And I think this comes into play most when we're talking about immunity and disease resistance. So honeybees have an immune system that's similar to ours, although it's quite simple. So they have kind of physical characteristics that prevent parasites or pathogens like bacteria and fungi from invading them. So the bee's cuticle is like our skin. So that's kind of the first line of defense against invading parasites for us and the bees. But then they also have physiology. So they have things that float around in their blood, their hemolymph, that are much like our white blood cells. So they're things that attack sort of invading bacteria or viruses that are floating around in the bee. So they have these individual immune defenses. But again, you have to think of a colony as an individual too. And colonies have their own defenses, and those we call social immunity. So this is kind of encompassing all of those individuals acting as cells within that colony. And so social immunity, these are really what we're talking about as traits or behaviors that all of those bees working together do to resist disease and parasites. So some things that have been studied at least a little bit are multiple mating of the queen. So we know that queens mate 20 times, and that actually has some disease resistance benefits. Probably one of the most studied ones is hygienic behavior. So if you've heard of hygienic behavior, that's where adult bees are able to detect a sick pupa or larva, and then they remove it from the colony. And they remove it before that disease can spread to the other larvae and pupa. So they're essentially eliminating that disease at the colony level. So it's really this perfect example of these individual bees working as kind of the white blood cells, pulling out the sick components from the colony, and then it prevents that whole colony from getting the disease. Now there's kind of this other idea, and that's the focus of what I'm going to talk about too, and that's the use of antimicrobial compounds. So some ants and termites, they spread these antifungal secretions that they make themselves around their nest to prevent mostly fungal growth. Well, bees collect propolis, which is highly antimicrobial, and my idea has been that bees are using these antimicrobial compounds as a type of social immune defense. So the fact that honeybees are collecting resin isn't something that's special and super unique to honeybees. I know everybody in this room thinks the honeybee is the most amazing creature on the planet, and they do something that no other insects can do. But actually, this idea of insects using these plant resins is fairly widespread across bees and even some ants. So especially in the tropics. So this is actually a stingless bee. Laser pointers don't work on TVs. So that top picture up there, that's a stingless bee nest, and so that's a tropical species. They actually combine resin with soil and make their whole nest out of that mixture. And that they call geopropolis. But the special thing about honeybees is that they get their own word for the resin they use, and that is propolis. So propolis is really a honeybee-specific term, And that's the resins that they're bringing back. They mix it with wax and put it in the hive. So where are they getting these resins from? Should I use that as, yeah. Thank you. All right, so these resins, as we said, are antimicrobial. So plants are producing these resins as a defense. Here you can see a pine tree, a loblolly pine from Raleigh, North Carolina, basically oozing this resin from a wound. So the plants are producing these resins to protect themselves against their own parasites and pathogens. They also protect leaf buds. So as these plants are growing, they want to protect those young leaves from herbivores and other insects. So that's a leaf bud there. And then, all kinds of different species of herbaceous trees and shrubs produce resin. So pine, poplar, not tulip poplar though, which isn't a real poplar, birch and gum, all kinds of different trees are producing these resins, and bees will get it from anything that produces it. Now these resins are very chemically diverse. There'll be 50 to 150 compounds in a mixture of these resins. So they're really complex mixtures, and of course they change based on the plant source. Now, in terms of its antimicrobial properties in this chemical mixture, we've really known that propolis has these properties for thousands of years. So propolis has been thought to have used in the embalming process, at least somewhat, by Egyptians, and then Stradivarius, the famous violin maker, was said to use propolis as a varnish for his violins. But most of this information that we know about propolis comes from a human aspect, particularly in Eastern Europe, South America, and Asia, where kind of more homeopathic remedies are more commonly used and more acceptable. There's a strong interest in propolis as a product. And we know, and it's really hard not to sound like I'm sort of a witch doctor saying propolis is a cure-all magic ingredient, but basically almost everything that propolis has been tested on, at least in the lab, it does have some activity against it. It's been shown against all kinds of bacteria, fungi, and even tumor cells, both in cell cultures and in rats and mice. It can enhance activity of ointments, and while there is some regional difference in activity level against some things, propolis from all over the world does have similar activity, even though the chemical compounds are different and the plant sources are different. So it's really this kind of special, unique mixture. But when I was first started out researching this and doing work in Minnesota on propolis, I said, I don't care about humans. I want to know about bees, and why is this important for bees? And surprisingly, there is very limited information on the role of propolis in a hive. There have been several lab studies, however, some showing that if you put propolis on a varroa mite, that it either kills it or kind of drugs it a little bit, but putting pretty much anything on a mite in a petri dish won't make it happy. So that wasn't terribly informative. Chalk brood, there have been now 2 studies showing propolis is effective against chalk brood in lab cultures. And this is just one example of a very recent study done showing regional differences in activity of propolis against chalk brood. So this is kind of the growth. Sorry. Too many things in my hand. So you have the growth of the fungi, so 100% would be a lot of growth, and then the concentration. So the lines that are on the top, which unfortunately Raleigh is a part of, those ones didn't inhibit growth very much. And then these bottom lines, Lincoln, Nebraska, Tucson, Arizona, and a California location, they inhibited chalk brood more, again, in basically petri dishes. Similar things have been shown for American foul brood. But basically, all of these did have activity against both this bacteria and fungi, but there is some regional variation in how effective they are. So my main question is, so we have this idea that there should be some, that Propolis does work against these hive diseases, but does it actually function this way in a colony? So in order to address this question, first wanted to step back and say, okay, bees didn't basically evolve in our square boxes. How are they using Propolis in the wild? And how are they using it in natural ways? So we wanted to look at where they're putting resins in the nest. And basically, in feral colonies that are nesting in tree cavities, they line the entire nest with a very thin layer of Propolis that we call the Propolis envelope. So that's that orange outline there. It's a very thin layer. And here you can see, so this is a review I have that's freely accessible if you want to look for it online. This is a cross-section of this tree cavity right here. There's the nest entrance. And you can see under that dotted line, that's where they were nesting, and that's a very thin layer of Propolis. They essentially varnished that inside of that nest with Propolis. We've seen this with pretty much every tree cavity that has come down that we've looked at. You can see the comb would basically be coming out, and above that dotted line where the nest isn't and where they haven't put a Propolis envelope, there is some fungal growth. So it does seem to at least be inhibiting that in the nest cavity itself. And this are just some pictures from that nest cavity and some other ones. You can see that we kind of call it that they make it bee smooth. So it's probably smooth on that very micro scale that the bees are looking at, but to us it looks just like a blobby mess. But you can see that they're really incorporating different colors of resin, so those are likely different tree sources within one hive, and they're really spreading it around, again, in mostly a very, very thin layer, essentially varnishing it. So how else are bees using resins, and both in these kind of wild and managed colonies? So one thing, if you've opened a beehive, especially if you've let it sit for a long time, you see a lot of Propolis on the frame rest and the edges, and then it gets all over your hand, and you wonder why bees collect it and want to get rid of them. But it's good, I swear. So they're mostly sealing cracks and holes in the nest. They want to keep their environment as stable as they can and for them. So that's what they're doing. They're controlling that environment. And it's important to note that some colonies, I'm sure as you've seen, and some races of honeybees do collect more Propolis. They can use wax that they produce themselves for everything that they use Propolis for. They can spread a thin layer of wax on the hive balls if they want, but they're collecting these plant materials. One of the coolest things I think that they do with Propolis is that they will encase or embalm intruders that are too big to remove from the nest if they kill them. So we'll do a little picture hunt. So try and find the large animal. So here we have a beetle that they've glued to the hive wall, but up there you have some kind of mammalian skull that they've essentially varnished with Propolis, really embalmed it, and glued it to the hive wall. This is a different tree cavity, again, the comb wood coming up. And so they really just glue that. So if you ever see a big blob of Propolis on your bottom board, or sometimes you might want to peel into it and see if you find a little mouse. It's actually not that surprising to find that. And it's totally clean and sanitized because it's been shellacked with Propolis. So other things that they do, and we don't know how commonly they do this, and part of this is that in the U.S., propolis has been really selected against, I think, passively in the U.S. For over 100 years because, again, people thinking that, oh, this colony, it's all glued up, it's going to take me 10 minutes to open it, I'm just going to leave that one alone and not breed from that queen. I'll go to this one that I can open up really easily and get the frames out so I don't kill the queen and all of that stuff. So it's kind of been this passive selection against propolis. I think in Europe they haven't passively selected against it quite as much, and in South America they are actually actively selecting for it, so they collect it on a totally different level than our bees probably ever will. But they basically, put it on the frames, but they also, sometimes they'll put it on the rim of the comb itself. So you can see that orangey tint to those cells there. That's all this thin layer of propolis that these cells have been lined with. We saw that more in feral colonies, and I've only seen it in managed colonies a couple times, but some people seem to think that that happens quite a lot. And what that does and what that function is, we don't really know. And as I said, they will constrict their nest entrances and close up the hive. So some colonies really hate a wide open bottom board, and some will just totally create these little tunnels for themselves out of propolis. Now in Brazil, where they are harvesting it, they essentially have boxes that are full of slats just like that wide, and they will remove a slat, the bees fill it up with propolis, they remove the next slat until they have a full wall of propolis, and then they'll knock it down and harvest it that way. So this usually takes a while for our bees to do, but theirs will do that in a couple days. So now how do bees collect the propolis? And the resins. So the resins are packed on their hind legs, just like they pack pollen. And these are a kind of a special subset of foragers. So from the colonies that I've observed over many years, it's less than 1% of the foragers that are actually getting these resins. So it's a very, very small number of bees that are collecting resin. And they won't necessarily collect resin for their whole life. They will for a whole day, but then the next day they might switch to something else. So the resin is here. So when you get used to it and sit out in front of hives for weeks on end and watch for resin foragers, you get really good at identifying them. But basically the resin's kind of semi-translucent. It's shiny. This one's particularly smooth. The other side, you can see it's a little wavy, whereas the pollen never really has quite that irregular shape, or not commonly anyway, because they pack it really well. But the pollen's always kind of, it looks like flour to me. It's that more dense texture, whereas the resin's always going to have that somewhat translucency. It can be all different colors: white, yellow, red, brown, orange, green, but it's always that kind of translucent color. Pollen can be shiny too, so it's not always that. But when you open up hives and you're looking on, especially in the outer edges, just take a peek before you smoke too much, because you can see resin foragers sometimes up there. So how do they get this? So basically, we think the propolis is sticky, so do the bees. This is a segment from this Queen of Trees Nature video on PBS. It's a really cool little segment. It doesn't focus on bees, but you can watch this 5 minutes and it's pretty cool. But basically, these bees play tug of war with the resins. They grab it with their mandibles, and then they move it from their front leg to the middle leg to the back leg, and then they'll do little test flights to see if they have enough, and then they'll eventually go back to the hive. But unlike when a pollen forager comes back, a resin forager can't unload this resin themselves. They have to they go deep into the hive, usually where it's going to be used. Then they wait for another bee to pull the resin off of them. So they really tug at them And sometimes this takes many bees. Sometimes they have to wait overnight. If they come back and it gets too cool, they have to go and sun themselves. So maybe it's an excuse for them to be lazy, but it's a really intensive process, much more so than nectar or pollen foraging. And additionally, when they're foraging for nectar and pollen, they can get some reward if they need it. They're getting some of that sugar boost if they need it, whereas a resin forager, they're not getting any direct reward or food from that resin foraging bout. And again, since they can use wax that they produce themselves for everything that they use resin for, why are they using this really energetically demanding resource? So the first thing that I wanted to do to test this was to look at how this propolis envelope affected sort of colony health dynamics. So in order to do this, I created propolis envelopes myself by painting nuke boxes with extracts of propolis. This is a Minnesota propolis, this is a Brazilian green propolis, and then the top one's a control, so just these extracts were done in alcohol, so I painted that with alcohol. Then I looked at the bees' immune systems and bacteria levels. And I'm not showing you a graph here, so I'm not overloading you with bars and everything, but the main thing here is that the bacteria in the colonies that I painted with propolis was reduced. So the propolis knocked down the bacteria, and then their immune systems of these bees was also reduced. So it seemed like knocking down the bacteria in these hives kind of freed up the bees' immune system. And so then the hypothesis here is sort of that if the bees are then sick, their immune systems are freed up to fight off whatever those pathogens are. So it's kind of like the idea if you're here in this nice facility, your immune system's just normal and active. So if you get a cold, if it is winter, you'll take a normal time to fight it off. But then if I get a cold and then I go and live in a moldy basement for a month, I'm fighting off all of those microbes in that moldy basement in addition to the cold. So it's going to take longer for me to fight that cold off. So that's what we think is happening here with propolis and the bees, that it's allowing them to free up their immune system. And bees or colonies made up of bees with sort of less activated immune systems, so bees that aren't constantly fighting off pathogens and microbes, they're more productive. They produce more honey. So and kind of at the base of this, it was kind of this first real finding that showed that the hive environment alone affects bee health, which is pretty cool. So what does this really mean? It really means that we need to know more, as most questions in science often prove. But it has these kind of subtle effects on bee health. But are there also kind of direct effects that propolis is having on bee disease? So to do this, I challenged colonies, again, that were either made resin-rich by painting them with the propolis envelope, or I left them without the propolis envelope, and I gave them chalk brood. So did this just by feeding it to them in pollen patties, and they eat it right up, and then they develop chalk brood. And after a month, 2 months, we looked at just the population level. So the total number of adult bees. Here we have the resin pore, and then these colonies where they had the propolis envelope. You can see it's not significant here, but there's definitely a trend that in these resin pore colonies that were challenged with chalk brood, they had lower populations than the ones that were enriched with the propolis envelope. And so this seems that this propolis, at least in the short term, is allowing colonies to maintain populations when they have this propolis envelope and they are challenged. And this is backed up by the fact that the propolis envelope reduced the intensity of these chalk brood infections. So this is here's a chalk brood mummy. So basically you count all the mummies in these colonies. In colonies that didn't have propolis, they had really high infection levels compared to the ones with the propolis envelope that had really minimal infections. So it does seem like that propolis being around the nest directly affects disease. So this got into the next question of, if propolis is having direct effects against disease, are they actually bringing in propolis when they're sick? Are they self-medicating? And so to do this, basically, this kind of similar colony setup. We had colonies that were unchallenged, and then colonies that we challenged with chalk brood. Basically closed the hive entrance for a certain amount of time before a challenge, and then counted the number of returning resin foragers. So here's a resin forager and then a pollen forager, and these were repeated many times. Give half these colonies chalk brood, do the counts again. So and this is really to account for any seasonal change that might occur in resin foraging. So if in the challenge colonies, they increase resin foraging more so than the control colonies, then we can say that they are self-medicating. And this is results from 3 years of study with chalk brood. And again, so a bar around 0 would indicate no change before and after this challenge. A positive number shows that they increase resin foraging when they're sick. And all 3 years showed the same trend in the data for chalk brood. And so bees are self-medicating with resin with respect to chalk brood. They don't do it for American foul brood. So there's something specific about chalk brood that they're responding to. I ended up doing this as part of a larger study here too, and each one of these lines is a different colony. And then the arrow in the middle, that's the average. So bees in North Carolina are self-medicating too. But you can see that there's a lot of colony level variation here. So is this something that's truly unique? And this really is. So when it comes to self-medication in the animal kingdom, or medication in general, it pretty much comes down to primates do it. And there's some evidence that some sheep do it. And there's some other little things here and there. But as far as insects goes, and really with the vertebrates too, it's a really unique example, because the bees aren't eating the resin, they're putting it in their hive, and the bees are responding to a pathogen that the larvae get, not the adults themselves. So they're responding as a colony to fight this disease by increasing resin collection. So we have a lot of studies to do about this, but it is a really interesting behavior and something that we're really excited about following up. So I think we obviously need to know more about how propolis is functioning, but it is an important form of disease resistance in honeybees. And it's kind of along with all of these other behavioral defenses that they have, and they work in concert. Just some other effects of propolis. So they will entomb contaminated pollen with propolis. This entombed pollen is something we've been seeing a lot more in the last 5 years. The pollen that's trapped under there is heavily, heavily contaminated with pesticides. And there's also evidence that kind of propolis or compounds within it might help detoxify pesticide exposure. And then there's some evidence that there's long-term benefits to the hive. So bees bred for high propolis have their colonies are more productive and have higher populations, and there might be some reduced disease long-term as well. So what does all of this mean for you, and what can you do with this information? So I think there's some implications for hive design especially if we're going from, the tree cavity nesting to, our typical managed Langstroth hive. So one question kind of is this propolis envelope important? And we have some evidence that it really does make a difference. So I think one thing that we can do fairly easily, especially if you're a small-scale beekeeper, is to basically adjust how the interior of the boxes is. Mimic that tree cavity that's not that smooth surface. And this could be done by using rough sawn wood to build your boxes. One thing is sometimes you will get, especially if you order a lot like we often do, you will get kind of a defective box that looks rough on the inside because it's a rough sawn wood. The companies that are making these boxes typically throw those away. But if you give them a box that's either rough sawn wood or this is one that I beat up with a wire brush, you can have the bees create their own propolis envelope. This is something that the bees are in just for a week, and they basically dotted that with propolis. They're filling it in with a really thin layer, whereas here, they're just putting on the frame rest like they normally do. The other thing that can be done, and that has been done by Renata Borba, who's at Minnesota now, is putting commercially available propolis traps on the sides of your boxes. You can easily fit, this is like 9 frames in there. 10 frames make it a little snug, but it can be done. But basically the bees will fill in that propolis trap on the side with propolis, and then you can peel that propolis trap off. The propolis stays to the hive wall, and then it can work for the season. At the end of the season, if you want, you can scrape it off much easier, more easily than if you get a propolis trap and try and harvest it that way yourself. And this works just as well as painting those extracts in propolis. So if you are going to collect it for other uses, so for yourself or if you're going to sell it, you can buy, again, these commercially available propolis traps. They basically go on top of a hive. It helps to put a rim around the edge with holes, so like a mite treatment rim that you would put on your colony, but you need to drill holes in it to help airflow go in, because that'll encourage them to fill it up, and light as well. The only thing with these is that they say that the propolis comes off like an ice cube tray, but it does not. You can try and freeze it for a while, but it depends how much the bees put on there. But yeah, I mean, you can see if they put it on the outside like that, you can scrape that off with a hive tool. But I really do like putting them on the inside. That seems to work better. You can do a lot of makeshift versions. This is corn bag that's doubled over and then put on top of the hive with the same rim. The key is that the holes need to be less than 1/4 inch wide, otherwise they'll start putting in comb. And the thing is here is, especially if you only have a few colonies, or if you only want to do this with one colony, you kind of might need to switch it around, because find that the one colony doesn't do anything and just leaves it totally open. Some will put really just wax in there, and then others will put propolis in. So you might have to play around with your colonies. But yeah, so again, it's best to increase light exposure and airflow. This would have a migratory cover over the top. And then collecting it, you can just use hive scrapings. If you get it from a propolis trap, it'll look nice and pretty like that. But if you're selling it to certain things, they don't care if it looks pretty. So it's kind of depend on your use. This would be great to get hive scrapings from. And then what to do with it, you can sell it to a whole bunch of different companies. Especially these hive scrapings, I think that's a good way to just get some easy money if you have enough colonies. And they do it by weight, so you're not getting the price that you would otherwise, but if you're going to throw it away, you might as well make a little money. You can also make a tincture, so that would be like an extract like I painted on the inside of my hives, but one that you would want to make with human grade products. If you go to blab.umn.edu, Gary has an easy little recipe and a handout on how to make these tinctures. But the basic idea is use 70% alcohol. Again, if you're going to consume it, make sure it's consumable. And then you basically put it in a jar, as much propolis as you have, cover it with alcohol, and let it sit in the dark. But basically, so the bottom line here is I think propolis can be a great resource for the bees and beekeepers alike. We still have a lot of work to do in figuring out all the different ways that we can use propolis. But I think, again, we really just need to encourage all of these natural defenses that bees have, so like hygienic behavior, grooming, and resin collection in our bees so that we can make them healthier really on their own. And I think that can really improve management success overall and just help us to help our bees. So with that, feel free to email me with any questions you ever have. Email's up there. And thanks again for having me.
So I have one question for you, Michael.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think I might have two. The first being, so if you make up a tincture, then you can go ahead and use it to almost artificially create an envelope if you wanted to spray it inside your hive.
Yeah, so
Alcohol will evaporate off, and then the propolis will be left behind.
yeah, that's exactly what I did. I used you can use rubbing alcohol or isopropyl, that you get at Walmart or. But I like the idea of having the bees make their own propolis envelope, even better than making the tincture and painting that. I know both do work, and so Renata, who's been doing some follow-up work in Minnesota, she did the traps in the inside and compared that to the propolis envelope, and they worked. That I painted exactly the same. And I just like the idea of the bees doing it because I think they'll refresh it more. Whereas if you paint it, I know it still smells the next season, but it's a lot of these volatile compounds, and so that effect isn't going to last more than a season, much more than a season. We don't know how long it lasts. Whereas if they're constantly bringing in fresh stuff, it's going to replace some of those volatiles that are key.
Now, when I make my propolis tinctures, I would go ahead and put the propolis in it once it has hardened into a coffee grinder and then add it to the alcohol. Is that similar to what you do when you make tinctures? So to make a tincture, you can grind it really finely, and that will basically you can let it sit for less time. If you grind it finely, you can freeze it too, and that'll harden really quickly. You can ruin a blender really easily that way too, though. But you can let it sit for a month if you don't grind it really fine. It's kind of 2 weeks is about the time, if it's not finely ground, that you're getting most of the active compounds out. But if you let it sit longer, it's not going to ruin it. It just won't get that much out of it. Mm-hmm. So if you're not grinding it as finely, you probably want it to sit a little bit longer, but it's not necessary. Can you speak real quickly about the Japanese study on mice and hair regrowth?
Yeah, I don't think I've read it fully, but there was a recent study on propolis and hair regrowth, and they think it's the new thing to cure baldness.
I'm thinking if there's any way we can convince people to save the bees,
It'll be through baldness. It's actually probably not a bad idea. They do put, propolis is put in some cosmetic products and that kind of stuff, not uncommonly. Although the only thing that people, you just have to be worried about allergy stuff whenever you deal with human stuff. And dermatitis is, which is dry skin, is the most common allergy that people have to propolis. And so people just have to be aware of that. But I think in terms of that kind of work will be done in Asia and South America and Eastern Europe. And it's great because we can make progresses there. It's really hard to do any human stuff with propolis in the US, partly because it's such a chemically diverse mixture. And it's really hard to control. Like the FDA wants to know that there's this much of this, and it's never going to happen. So it has to be in some kind of special category in the US. And it's going to be hard. It's really hard to get propolis work for human health done effectively.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In your studies, have you been able to, control for different types of resin available to the hive? Like if you were to put a lump of resin out by the hive, would they use that, or do they always just like foraging for it?
Yeah, we've tried to do that a little bit. When I first started, I really wanted to look at how they're handling it and that kind of stuff at the source. It's the kind of thing that if you're giving bees feed and there's other flowers out there, they don't want it. And sometimes that does happen with resin. There's a paper from the 1800s saying that we put out this twig and the bees went and got resin from it. But I've always done it in pretty, even in Raleigh where we do it, there's so many pine trees that, I can create a wound on this pine tree and hope that they go, and I maybe will get one. I think there's so much out there. But when there isn't very much, they'll go collect caulk that is recently laid, or asphalt, because it probably has a similar kind of terpene smells. So they will get random things.
I guess I'm interested more in the effects for the bees. Are they better from pine tree resin or?
Yeah, I think.
Is there any idea on which might be more beneficial?
Yeah, so certain sources are better from some things than other things, but I think like having the bees collect as many as they can is going to really benefit them. So it's just kind of, and I think that's what the idea behind propolis in general is, how it has so much activity because it has so many different compounds that it's hard for bacteria and fungi and parasites to develop resistance because it's a really complex mixture. And so if you're encouraging them to collect from all these different sources, you're just kind of boosting that mixture even further.
One question to find out. I know most of the clubs either have Italian bees or Russian bees. And there was an article I read, and I just got it from a pamphlet that I grabbed off of the Wake County, there's an article back there. And it said that the Russian bees were brought over back in the late 1800s because they had more exposure to, let's say, the varroa mite or something, and because of their hygienic behavior, they were able to actually, save off most of that, and then they brought them over here. And I was wondering, with the bees that you were using that were using this hygienic envelope, more likely to be Russian?
So the bees that most of this is done were Italian. Really, any bees, I think, in the U.S. are pretty much equally going to collect the same amount of propolis because, again, they don't collect a ton. I mean, some of them do collect a lot, but again, that's racially, it's not going to be that much different. There are some of the original strains. So one that is kind of similar to the Russian, the Caucasian bee that Steve Shepard's been trying to bring back in Washington. They're supposedly notorious for their resin collection, and carniolans are not supposed to collect any, although they do. I think they all do. So there is some of that, but that's going to be the kind of thing. hygienic behavior, that one I talked about where they remove disease, that's something that can be bred into any race of honeybees. So again, it's kind of figuring out which bee that you like the best. Some of them have different sort of management strategies in terms of how they build up and that kind of stuff. But in terms of resin collection, at least in the U.S., I think they're all pretty equal.
Can you shine any light on where the red resin, what breed of red resin they come from, or what kind?
Yeah, so the red in North Carolina, I think, is some birch. I'm not sure what else is red. I know that that is red. But even what we've been finding, so they're doing more source kind of identification in Minnesota, is that even within a species, the color can be totally variable, which is really weird, I think. But the pine tends to be either yellowish or white, like white.
Is there any website or any link or anything out there that you can go research the color of red?
No. There are very few. I might have some in that review paper on colors. I can't remember if I included that or not. I kind of was scouring through literature to see ideas of what.
We have one that is rainbow color.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more than likely multiple sources, but.
We have a heavy red.
Yeah, here where on Lake Wheeler, I see mostly the pine, but I had some bees at the kind of Edwards Mill too, and we saw a lot different. We saw some red there too, but I'm not sure what it is. It's hard to find a little bee on the top of a tree. Yeah.
I had a question. What is the relation between the cottonwood, juniper, or eucalyptus?
So I'm not sure that they collect resin from eucalyptus. The cottonwood is a great source, and I think from some of the evidence we have, it's probably better than juniper. But the eucalyptus, I'm not sure about. We had bees at NC State they were trying to grow some eucalyptus, and I was really hoping that the bees were going to visit the eucalyptus and see bees on it, and I never saw any bees, but they were younger trees, but they still had resin. I mean, you could see it and smell it. So, and the bees are right next to it. So, I'm not sure that they get it from eucalyptus.
Yeah,
but
the reason I was asking is because eucalyptus is a different usage for a kind of medicinal type.
yeah, absolutely. That's why I was really excited that they were planting eucalyptus right next to my bees.
I've seen in my own experience how they drip the resin, the eucalyptus.
Yeah, see, I didn't see them dripping from it. I was just the leaves that are, shiny with the resins, and so the bees can get it from either way. So maybe they need it from the wounds.
When it opens up, it has a tendency to produce a resin.
Ah.
I've seen it because we got probably close to probably to 100 years.
Wow, cool.
Old. And that's what I experienced that.
Yes, these were young, and they weren't seeding, so I'll have to look into that. They cut them down, though. So I'll have to find yours. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks.